Today's topic from Chapter 11 in your macroeconomics book is changes in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Now, all of you know from reading your syllabus that your final exam in macroeconomics will cover 4 chapters, 10, 11, 12, and 13. You should know that today's topic probably covers 4, perhaps 5 essay questions from your final exam. So it is very important that you watch very carefully today, take good notes where you can, rewatch this videotape if it is helpful. But before you watch, if you have not read Chapter 10 of the macroeconomics book, this is not going to help you that much today. Matter of fact, I would suggest before you watch this that you read Chapter 10 and read Chapter 11 so that the things that I do today will come to life, so to speak, and you'll be better prepared to understand and quickly apply what I lecture on today. So let's begin. You saw in Chapter 10 that we have a measure of the macroeconomic performance of the economy called the gross domestic product, which is equal to the sum of consumption plus private investment plus government spending plus or minus net exports. You also saw in Chapter 10 that when we measure aggregate economic performance, we use something called the Consumer Price Index, which is a very complicated formula to measure the rate of upward movement in the price level for an aggregate of goods and services in the economy each year. So today, with aggregate supply and aggregate demand analysis, you see that we've set this up very similarly. If you think back to Chapter 6 and 7 of your book, where we had price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis, it's very similar in the basic construct of aggregate demand. Aggregate simply means total, after all, and aggregate supply, where instead of having the price of peaches or gasoline and the quantity of peaches or gasoline, we have the measure of the price change for all goods and services in the economy, and Q is represented by the quantity of all goods and services in the economy, the gross domestic product. So to erase the reminder from Chapter 6 and 7, and to begin, we will see in a moment that the aggregate supply curve for our country looks different than the normal supply curve that slopes upward and to the right along the entire range of the supply curve. The aggregate supply curve has a flat segment that we will call segment 1. It has a positively sloped segment that we will call segment 2, and a vertical segment that we will call segment 3. The aggregate demand curve slopes downward and to the right, just like normal demand curves do, and we'll label it AD. And we will start out here at point A on the first graph. Now, I want to remind you of something that you read about in Chapter 10 when it came to the discussion of unemployment. For our purposes today, point A is going to represent what economists call full employment. Full employment occurs not where the unemployment rate is 0%, but full employment occurs where the actual unemployment rate, denoted by UR, equals what we call the natural rate of unemployment. So far, this is all by way of review. In June of 2010, the last month for which we have unemployment data available before this lecture, the unemployment rate in the United States of America was equal to 9.5%. From your reading, you'll see that on any given day, the natural rate of unemployment, NRU, it's debated what this rate is. Typically, or historically, we've seen economists suggest that the natural rate of unemployment can be as low as 3.5%, maybe as high as 4.5%. So we'll pick the middle ground and say that the natural rate of unemployment is 4%. Now recall, the natural rate of unemployment is the sum of frictional unemployment, unemployment associated with people who have left jobs that did not work out, or new people entering the labor force, or people who were working for a while, left the labor force to retire or take care of children or what have you, and then came back to the labor force. So those are the frictionally unemployed people. So it's frictional plus structural unemployment. Structural unemployment being unemployment associated with changes in technology and permanent decreases in the demand for certain goods and services. So recall, it is natural to our economy to always have some unemployment. If you ever hear a politician campaign on a promise to bring unemployment down to 0%, I would suggest you do not vote for that politician because they do not know much about economics. It is an impossibility to bring unemployment to 0% because that would mean getting rid of frictional unemployment, meaning we never again have people looking for their first job or re-entering the labor force or quitting a job and looking for another one, and we never have changes in technology that get rid of certain jobs, or we never again have a permanent decrease in the demand for anything from horse and buggies to VCRs or other things like that. So if we add up frictional and structural unemployment, it guarantees us that whether the economy is in recession or whether the economy is growing, you can naturally expect to see about 4% unemployment or thereabouts at any given time. Well, you see that the unemployment rate for June of 2010 was 9.5%. It had gone over 10% several months earlier. I don't know when you'll be watching this lecture, and this could be 2013 or 2023 for all I know. But whenever you're watching it, doing a direct comparison of the unemployment rate, and you could go on the internet to find out what it is for the month that you're watching this, any comparison of the actual unemployment rate to the natural rate of unemployment gives you an idea of how close we are to full employment. Well, you see here, since we are at 9.5% unemployment, and we could normally expect to see 4% unemployment on any given time, at any given time, 9.5% minus 4% is 5.5%. And you should recall from your readings that the third type of unemployment is cyclical unemployment. This is unemployment associated with contractions and recessions in the economy. So at the time that this lecture is being provided, we currently have approximately 5.5% cyclical unemployment, people who are still unemployed because the economy at this time is struggling. Technically, the economy is currently recovering from the recession that we were in from 2007 through 2009, but the recovery is far from complete. As a matter of fact, as of this moment, the recovery is somewhat in doubt, and so we still have many people that are unemployed because of the downturn and sluggishness in the economy. So if we were at point A, that would mean that the unemployment rate would be approximately 4%, because it would, at that point, recall the natural rate of unemployment is approximately 4%. So when we eventually get back to the point where there's no cyclical unemployment, where the recession that we went into is completely over and the demand for labor has gone up enough so that those people who are unemployed for cyclical reasons now have jobs. When we get to the point where the unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate of unemployment, then we will have achieved what economists call full employment. So for our purposes today, we are going to start from point A, assuming an economy in full employment, and then we're going to assess what happens when aggregate demand goes down, what happens when aggregate demand goes up. Then we'll look at what happens when aggregate supply goes down and what happens when aggregate supply goes up. So again, the foundation material from Chapter 10 you should have already taken care of. This is going to help us understand the causes of recessions, the causes of inflation, the causes of stagflation, and non-inflationary economic growth. And when you're done here and you have a complete understanding of the four major changes that can take place in our economy, you'll be ready to move on to Chapter 12 and Chapter 13. Just as a preview, Chapter 12 will look at three of the four major schools of thought on what to do about changes in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Chapter 13 will take a look at a school of thought that dominated in the 1980s, a little bit in the 1960s and late 1990s, the fourth perspective on what to do about changes in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So let's move on and start fresh with a new diagram. CPI, GDP, aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and in equilibrium at point A, we'll call this CPI 1, GDP 1. Okay, the first topic for today will be decreases in aggregate demand, the causes of recessions. Every one of you watching this today has been impacted in some way by the recession the United States of America went into starting in December of 2007, running through officially 2009. And by the time you're watching this, we may be back in another recession. There are many economists here in the summer of 2010 that are very concerned about experiencing what we call a double dip recession, where the economy goes into a recession, begins to grow out of it slightly, but economic forces start to pile up again, causing the economy to slip back into recession. So again, I have no way of knowing where the economy is as you're watching this. I hope the unemployment rate is 4% while you're watching this. Probably won't be. But what we're going to do today is examine the 5 major causes of recessions with some particular emphasis on the recession that we've most recently gone into. Okay. Historically, recessions can be caused by any of the following: an increase in taxes. You will see from your reading, and we may have time to briefly discuss today, that the last time we had a recession that was principally caused by higher taxes was the recession of 1990 and 91. Recessions can take place as a result of increases in interest rates. The recession that took place in 1982 was in large part caused by higher interest rates. Now, I should stop here and mention something to you for the purposes of your studying. Make sure you do not get it locked into your brain that any time there's a tax increase or an increase in interest rates, that the economy is going to go into a recession. That is not the case. What we're looking at today are times in America's history where a tax increase or an increase in interest rates or any of these other events happened at a time and of a magnitude so that a recession did come about. But do not operate under the mindset that if the Federal Reserve Bank increases interest rates by 1/4 percentage points that the economy is going to hurtle into a recession. It doesn't work that way. Third cause of recessions, drops in consumer and business confidence. We will see that the 2007 through 2009 time period was covered by this particular event. Number 4, large, sudden decreases in government spending. This is going to require a little bit of analysis so as to make sure you understand the role of government spending in our economy, and when government spending should go down and when it should not go down as quickly or as much as in other times. And number 5, recessions in foreign nations. By the way, going back number 4 for a moment, late 1940s was the last time we had a recession, largely caused by a drop in government spending, and the Great Depression that began in 1929 was actually triggered primarily by events that culminated in 1930, where Congress raised tariffs dramatically and helped reduce world trade. So we may have time to get to that as well today. Okay. So these are the major events that can cause aggregate demand to decrease. If we label our aggregate demand curve AD1, a recession takes place when aggregate demand decreases by a large enough amount to cause the economy to slump into segment 1 of the aggregate supply curve. We'll call this point B, where we end up in equilibrium at CPI2 and GDP2. Let me erase a little bit for a moment. Okay. So graphically, this is what a recession looks like. Now, first of all, let's point out some of the good news and bad news that we get from recessions before we get into more of the technical details of how this took place in more recent times. Economists, Harry Truman once said that he wished he could find a one-handed economist, because he would ask his economists a question. They would say, well, Mr. President, if you do this, on the one hand, the good news will be this will happen, but on the other hand, and they would always give him the offsetting bad news. So he said he wished he had a one-handed economist so he could just get the good news. Well, when we go into a recession, and some of you may have experienced this in these times, there's good news and bad news. First of all, notice at point B that the bad news is that the gross domestic product has decreased. And with a decrease in the gross domestic product, we're of course going to get an increase in cyclical unemployment, which in the last recession we got to 10.2% unemployment at one point. So you get an increase in cyclical unemployment. Of course, you get an increase in everything from business closings to home foreclosures. Also during recessions, some of the sociological impacts, normally we see an increase in the divorce rate. Often we see an increase in crime, although in this last recession that did not materialize. We tend to see an increase in drug and alcohol abuse. The domestic abuse shelters tend to fill up very quickly during recession. So it's not just a matter of people losing their jobs, as bad as that is, or businesses closing down, or people losing their homes, but this has a ripple effect, psychologically and sociologically speaking, that impacts millions of people and their family members. So that is terrible news whenever the economy goes into a decline of this nature. But there also is good news whenever we go into a recession. Notice what happens to the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index decreases, which means we get a decrease in the problem of inflation. In a nutshell, we start to see prices coming down. In 2007 through 2009, we saw home prices fall dramatically. You recall the price of gasoline that had been over $4 a gallon in many parts of the country ended up going to less than $2 a gallon as the demand for gasoline went down. People stopped going on as many vacations. Businesses were reducing capacity or going out of business, so they needed less energy and fewer drivers. We saw decreases in car prices. Remember all the 0% financing. In many ways, a recession creates what some economists call a vulture economy. Think of it this way. You've seen old westerns where a horse dies out in the desert and the vultures start to circle that dead carcass. Well, a vulture economy is similar in that whenever we go into a recession, a lot of people begin to sell their assets to get liquid, economists call it. Cash is more liquid. It's more easily transferable in transactions than gold or real estate. So a lot of people, when they're facing financial difficulties, begin to sell off everything from their guitar collections to cars, expensive jewelry, things that they do not need because they actually need cash to stay in their homes or keep their businesses going. So with such a large increase in the supply of these sorts of goods and services as people are trying to get cash, the increase in supply, you recall from Chapter 7, causes surpluses, and causes prices to fall dramatically. So during a recession, if you're in a situation where you have a stable job, if you manage your finances fairly well, if you've been good with your money and you're not a big spender, but you have a hobby or you're looking for a house, during a recession, it's an ideal time. It's a buyer's market then, and you can save tremendous amounts of money. So recessions come with this double-edged sword, so to speak, where on the one hand we have to deal with higher unemployment and all of the ramifications of that, but on the other hand we see prices fall to levels that can bring a lot of financial relief for a lot of families. Okay. The recession that we went into in 2007 through 2009, many of you recall, was around the time we had what people were calling the housing crisis. You recall reading chapter 7 of your book, where economists called it a housing correction. We had seen a dramatic increase in the demand for homes all over the United States of America, financed primarily by historically low interest rates and what Alan Greenspan referred to when he talked about the stock market once, but could easily be referred to the housing market, what could be referred to as irrational exuberance, people becoming very excited about the idea of housing prices going up so that they could buy houses that were in bad condition and fix them up and flip them for sale. We saw many people during the housing boom, many businesses that owned apartment complexes, they converted their apartments into condominiums so they could sell the condominiums at very high market prices. So we saw, leading up to the recession of 2007 and 2009, this historical run-up, dramatic run-up in housing prices, fueled primarily by that last determinant of demand called expectations concerning future prices. So many people thought that housing prices were going to continue to go up and up and up, that they thought if we don't jump in now and buy a house while we can, the price is going to keep rising. Well, when everybody jumps into the market to buy, that fuels the very increase in demand that those people were fearing, and it fuels the price increases. In other words, the future gets here a lot faster. So we saw prices increasing dramatically, but just like when you go back to the stock market crash of 1929, the stock market correction, the dot-com stock market correction in 2000, and any other time throughout history, whenever the demand for anything continues to go up, fueled primarily by expectations concerning higher future prices, what eventually happens is that suppliers see those prices going up and up, and the suppliers begin to pour into the marketplace to take advantage of the high prices. We saw it take place in 2000 when everybody was buying internet stocks, and prices went to such a high level that eventually the people that held those stocks decided to take their profits, and they began to sell off their stocks, and that caused a big increase in supply. And with the increase in supply came lower and lower stock prices until the marketplace corrected. So please bear in mind, markets always correct, and the housing market is no different. This is why many economists don't call it a housing crisis. We refer to it as a housing correction, because the forces that caused prices to go to levels that really did not make a great deal of economic sense ended up creating the very same forces that brought us back to reality. But the reality in this particular case was very painful, because when the suppliers saw that huge increase in prices, and people in your neighborhoods, you may recall, began to put their houses up on the market all over the country, in Florida, Nevada, California, in many parts of the country, we saw developers clearing large swaths of land, putting in the sewer systems and putting in the street lights, putting in the roads to build the latest subdivision. We mentioned, of course, the apartments being converted to condos. So all these new developers coming in, your neighbors putting your house for sale, all of the investors buying up houses that nobody lived in, fixing them up and putting those on the market. All of that is an increase in the supply of available homes. And when that started to happen, those high prices that triggered more sellers in the market caused supply to increase, and as supply increased, we started to see prices begin to drop. Now, when prices began to drop, that also kicked in that last determinant of supply, expectations concerning future prices. And a lot of people thought, oh my goodness, prices are starting to fall. I better dump this property while I can and get the most amount of money I can for it. So we began to see more and more sellers trying to dump their properties that previously had held for investment or held because they wanted to live there, whatever the case might be. And when all of those people started flooding in, that caused an even bigger increase in supply, bigger drops in prices, and now the value of people's homes were starting to collapse. Well, the problem, of course, was that many people, if we look at the first decade of this century, many people that had bought those houses to begin with, if you go back and check any of the news reports, the Wall Street Journal, what have you, many people were buying homes during the run-up that really could not afford those homes. They didn't have stable employment. They didn't have very good credit. They didn't have the historical requirement of 20% down as a down payment on the house. So to make a long story short, primarily as a result of government pressure on banks to extend credit to more and more Americans, pressure from, not really pressure from the Bush administration, but assistance from the Bush administration to help lower income people pay for their down payments with taxpayer dollars, with banks extending credit to people that historically wouldn't have been able to get a loan because the banks thought that housing prices were going to continue to go up as well. A combination of free market excess, you might say, where the banks became excited that prices were going to go up and they thought that the riskier loans would still be profitable, and government pressure and government support in the marketplace. All of that fueled the increase in the demand. But when the market began to correct dramatically, millions of people who had borrowed money, especially at adjustable rate mortgages where they paid practically nothing down, and they signed on to mortgages with very low starter interest rates, well, eventually those interest rates those mortgages started to reset, the interest rates began to go up, and now those people were in a situation where they were not able to cover their monthly payments. A lot of Americans who, during the run-up, had borrowed money against their house, they'd taken out home equity lines of credit to buy motorcycles or go on vacations or add swimming pools, whatever the case might be. Now we were starting to see housing prices drop, so many more Americans were not able to go to the banks to refinance or to take money out because the equity in their home was dropping. Their homes were becoming worth less and less. So now all of a sudden, in what is probably the biggest investment you will ever make in your life, in the housing market, we started to see a massive correction, massive drops in prices, and we began to see foreclosures. We began to see investors who had borrowed millions of dollars to refurbish homes not able to pay the money back because they weren't able to sell it to people who are now not able to get credit. And so, with this drop, we saw a deterioration of trillions of dollars in net wealth in our economy. Wealth is measured by the value of all of our assets, our cash on hand plus our homes and our cars and your baseball card collection, whatever you may have that comprises your wealth. And when wealth began to drop, when people saw that they were less wealthy than they were before, both businesses and individuals became deeply concerned about their personal finances, and this caused a large drop in consumer and business confidence. And when confidence in the economy began to drop, businesses started to cut spending dramatically. Consumers began to cut spending dramatically. After all, we began seeing some of the largest increases in the savings rate that we had seen since before the Great Depression. So with consumers pulling back, with businesses pulling back, recall the GDP is equal to consumption, which is 70% of the economy, plus investment, plus government, plus or minus net exports. When consumer spending began to drop and business investment spending began to drop, that gave us the large drop in aggregate demand, and the economy settled at a much lower gross domestic product, and the consumer price index began to fall as well. So this in a nutshell is a picture of what we have been through or what we went through from 2007 and through 2009. In your book, you will read about the other causes of recessions. The picture's the same, large drop in aggregate demand, but in the book you can sort out other times in our history where aggregate demand has dropped enough to cause the problem that we've illustrated here. Okay, let's go to the next page and see if we can assess. Actually, I think for our purposes it might be better to use the eraser and keep working with this graph so you don't have to keep drawing diagrams. So let me clean this up just a bit. And let's look at Roman numeral 2, increases in aggregate demand. Okay, the good news for our economy historically, and there's no reason to believe now is any different, the good news is what goes down always comes up. You recall in Chapter 10 looking at the business cycle, where over time the GDP increases, reaches a peak, falls into recession, recession ends, the economy grows again, falls into another recession. So you recall seeing the business cycle. You never saw a graph that showed this, where at this time period the GDP is equal to 0. If the GDP ever equals 0, it will be because it's the end of the world. There will be no consumption, no businesses, no government, no export. So until we get to that situation, the permanent recession, we will always see the economy recover from recessions. So, starting at point B, let's ask the question, how can we get from AD2 to AD3 where aggregate demand increases and we end up at point C? Well, if we go back and take a look at the forces that caused aggregate demand to go down, common sense would suggest that the opposite of those forces causes aggregate demand to go up. So if we see a decrease in taxes, and again, it doesn't always work. It depends on the magnitude and the timing of these events to cause a big enough change in aggregate demand to get us out of economic problems. But historically, lower taxes, lower interest rates, increases in business and consumer confidence. If we see economic growth in foreign countries, and large increases in government spending, more on that in a moment, historically those are events that can begin to propel aggregate demand forward. Well, let's take a look at what we have taking place in current times. Well, looking at number 2 for just a moment, the Federal Reserve Bank has kept interest rates at as close to 0% as is possible, the interest rate that they set for banks to charge one another for overnight loans. Recently, home mortgage rates were around 4.25 to 4.5%. So as of the time this lecture is being delivered, interest rates have been kept at a very, very low level. In terms of taxes, the time period that we're looking at right now, 2010, we've seen very small changes in the withholding allowance for workers, which has led to a little bit of tax relief. We haven't seen large drops in income or corporate taxes at this point. In fact, we are looking at the possibility of the opposite taking place. But we have seen lower interest rates. We haven't been seeing much of an increase in business and consumer confidence, so that one is not taking place. Economic growth in foreign countries, with the exception of Brazil and Canada and a few other places, we have been seeing mostly financial crises taking place in foreign countries. But what we have been seeing primarily since the election of President Obama, very, very large increases in government spending. We have seen a stimulus package of almost $800 billion. We have seen the bailouts of banks and the automobile industry, and mounting pressure from the Obama administration on foreign countries. Many countries, in response to the crisis in Greece and Spain and other places, are now beginning to try to cut government spending. Recently, Mr. Obama's team told them that we should be doing exactly the opposite. So again, I don't know what's taking place with respect to government spending or the scale of it at the time you're watching this, but for 2009 and 2010, the United States government has been on a spending spree that has caused the largest increases in both our national debt and yearly deficits in our nation's history by far. Well, the Obama administration's opinion is quite clear. He said when he became president of the United States of America that the primary forces that drive job creation in the long run is the private sector, but he said that with the private sector being in such a weakened condition that government right now, and I'm paraphrasing, is the only institution with the resources available to increase aggregate demand. So the current philosophy has been to try to boost aggregate demand by having government spending increase dramatically. We will talk for another lecture later on this semester, the one on chapters 12 and 13. We will talk about the theories of this and where it comes from, whether it's working or not. All we're doing right now is proposing what if an increase in government spending or any of these other factors take place, and what happens if aggregate demand goes up as a result. So, if eventually the massive increase in government spending and low interest rates, those are the 2 out of the 5 that we have seen taking place at this time, if those are eventually successful in boosting aggregate demand, obviously aggregate demand will shift to the right and will end up at point C. What is interesting about point C, first of all, notice that GDP goes up to GDP 3, so we now see an increase in the gross domestic product. And notice at point C, the Consumer Price Index, CPI 3, is equal to CPI 2. So you recall with normal supply and demand analysis, very quickly, we have demand and supply, the initial price, initial quantity. When demand goes up, normally we see prices go up and quantity increases. Well, we're seeing the increase in quantity as the GDP goes up, but we're not seeing the increase in price. That's because we're seeing a situation where, at least for a short-run period of time, the aggregate supply curve, many economists argue, has a more horizontal slope where we get the increase in GDP, but we don't get the corresponding increase in inflation. Why? Well, very simply, think of it this way. When the economy begins to grow again out of a recession, which is what we are in currently in 2010, we're in a situation where economic growth is beginning to increase slightly. When the economy begins to grow and businesses begin to rehire people, and they are doing that at a very slow pace, initially, businesses can tap into the workers that have been cyclically unemployed, call them back without having to increase their wages dramatically or if at all. In fact, the Wall Street Journal reported several months ago that in this current recovery that's taking place, the average worker that is being called back to his or her previous job is coming back at a pay rate that is 40% less than what they had earned before they were laid off. That is a staggering figure that you can confirm by going on to Google and looking at this for yourself, or some other internet search engine if that's your preference. So look at what's taking place here. Let's borrow for a moment from a normal supply and demand curve. Let's put wage on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. Here we have the demand for labor, the supply of labor, and initial wage rate W1, initial equilibrium quantity of labor demanded and supplied at Q1. Okay. The economy goes into a recession, and during a recession, if the demand for all goods and services are going down, then the demand for labor is going to go down as well. Businesses aren't going to want as many people as before. Well, notice immediately, here's the quantity of labor demanded, here's the quantity supplied. So a surplus of labor begins to emerge. The surplus would normally put downward pressure on wages to W2, and we would see a decrease in the equilibrium quantity of labor supplied. But what often happens in the labor market is actually this. We have the wage rate and quantity. Here's the demand for labor, the supply, initial wage rate and quantity. When the demand for labor goes down, a lot of businesses don't want to try to negotiate lower wages and salaries with their workers. It's very time-consuming, it's very costly. Many businesses have unions that they have to deal with, and so they don't want to hassle with trying to get unions to take wage concessions. So what they do, instead of trying to get wages to go down, they simply lay people off. And the layoffs mean that we end up with a surplus of labor and an increase in unemployment. So the second diagram that I've drawn is a more accurate reflection of what happens in the labor market during recessions. So let's flip this thing around. When the economy begins to grow again and aggregate demand starts to go up, it naturally stands to be true that the demand for labor will start to go up. So D2 represented demand for labor during the recession. D3 represents the demand for labor when the economy begins to recover. Notice, at the same wage rate as before, now here's the quantity of labor demanded, here's the quantity supplied, so this surplus that had been from here all the way to here is now from here to here. So we have a smaller surplus of labor. So see, at the same wage rate as before, businesses simply begin to rehire their workers, and if we want to be real technical about it, what's happening, if we want to look at the equilibrium wage rate here, they're rehiring at lower wages. So whether they're calling people back at the previous wage rate or one lower, at least for a while, businesses don't have to pay out more in labor costs. Same thing is true with capital equipment. During a recession, a shoe manufacturer puts plastic covers over the machinery that makes shoes. When the economy begins to grow again, they take the covers off. Initially, they don't have to add more capital equipment or expand their operations. Therefore, if aggregate demand increases initially and we see an increase in the gross domestic product, we can see the consumer price index staying stable at first. Prices don't go up because the cost of doing business is not going up. They're not having to pay higher wages and capital expenses, and so at least in the initial stages of the recovery, and this is exactly what we're seeing right now in 2010, inflation is at very low levels even though the economy is recovering. Initially, businesses don't have to raise prices because their costs aren't going up. And it's also, for you business majors out there, it's also a pretty good idea not to raise your prices when the economy begins to recover, because you're still talking about people that have a lot less money than they used to have. And if you want to be competitive, one of the worst things you can do is right when the economy begins to recover, start to raise your prices on your consumers who are still struggling to make ends meet. So here we are now at point C, and if we continue this on, eventually every recession we've gone into has led to an increase in aggregate demand over time until we end up right back at point A. We're not there now. We could probably say that as of July 14th, 2010, with an unemployment rate of 9.5%, that C is a pretty good indication of where we are now. I hope by the time you're watching this that we are at point A or somewhere close to it, but it remains to be seen how quickly we may end up getting there. What I hope we're not experiencing by the time you are watching this is an economy that's out here. We'll call this AD4 and point D. Using our eraser for just a moment, We just saw that if aggregate demand begins to increase in segment 1, then all you get is an increase in the gross domestic product without a corresponding increase in inflation. But if aggregate demand continues to increase, now we get the problem of inflation. And if I can remember how to spell, we'll be in good shape. Okay. At point D, this is where we're now experiencing inflation. Let's go back to a normal supply and demand curve for just a moment and take price and quantity. And let's just say this is the market for construction materials. Here we have demand, supply, price, and quantity. Okay. During a recession, we see the demand for construction materials coming down. That leads to surpluses and lower prices. Q2. So here's the recession's impact on construction materials. As the economy grows, eventually back to where the economy was at full employment, we get right back to where we were before. But if the economy continues to grow, and we get out here to say, we'll just call this D4 so it matches AD4 up here. Notice that at P1, we're way out here. Here's quantity demanded. Here's quantity supply. This is all by way of review from Chapter 7. And now from here to here, we have shortages. So this is a situation that has not taken place in a long time. It's been, we have not experienced inflation rates of this magnitude since the very early 1980s. And in many ways, the Federal Reserve Bank, which we'll read about in Chapter 12, has helped keep a lid on this problem happening again. But if we ever get an increase in aggregate demand of this scale, and we could get it from massive increases in government spending, we could get it from certain types of tax cuts that fuel huge increases in consumer spending, we could get it from rampant economic growth in China, India, Eastern Europe, which fuels huge increases in the demand for our goods and services, and other forces that cause aggregate demand to change. If we ever get this situation, at point D, notice you still get the increases in GDP. We'll call this GDP4. The economy doesn't grow as much because now businesses are running out of space and capital is in short supply. It's hard to get good labor. But notice up here at CPI4, now we get huge increases in inflation. Because these shortages, back over here on our construction equipment diagram, these shortages eventually are met with big increases in prices. We'll call this P4 and Q4 to correspond to where we're at now. So these higher prices have to be paid somewhere. And by the way, this is not only a problem in construction materials, but this would also be the diagram that would apply to labor. If the demand for labor continues to go up and up and up, when we get to point A, recall, now we're at full employment, but up here at point D, it's a very unusual situation where the unemployment rate is now less than the natural rate of unemployment. Where the natural rate of unemployment at around 4%, we might see unemployment of, say, 3%. So what's happening at point D is that we've already reached point A where the cyclically unemployed people now have jobs, but as the economy keeps growing up to point D, now people that are frictionally unemployed and structurally unemployed, they're starting to get jobs too. And you might say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, recall that there's a trade-off between unemployment and inflation when aggregate demand goes down. When we go into recession, bad news, higher unemployment, business bankruptcies, decrease in the GDP. Good news, lower inflation. Well, when we're up here at point D, the good news is that we get a dramatic increase in the unemployment rate. Practically everybody who wants a job has one. But the bad news is you get the increase in the consumer price index. Think of it this way. When the unemployment rate falls too much, which is what's happening here, think about the people who are frictionally and structurally unemployed. Among the structural unemployed, maybe you have a bank teller who has worked as a bank teller for 30 years. the job is eliminated because of ATM machines, and now the bank teller is going through retraining to do something new. Well, their productivity isn't going to be that great while they're going through retraining. Somebody, a 16-year-old worker looking for their very first job, think about how productive you were when you were 16. I know I wasn't. Think about a grandmother or grandfather that leaves the labor force to retire when they're 67, and when they're 73, they decide they're bored and they go back to work. Think about the retraining there. If you look at the frictionally and structurally unemployed folks out there, the productivity isn't as good historically. Often the turnover rate is much higher. So during a booming economy, you see businesses so desperate for labor that they'll basically hire anybody that they can find. Well, hiring anybody you can find means you're going to have to dip deeper and deeper into the pool of the people who are normally naturally unemployed, and you're going to be getting less and less productive workers. Your best workers, by the way, look, during a booming economy, at point D, the best workers at your company are going to come to you and say, I want a pay raise or I quit, and I want my raise to be 15%. And you may find yourself inclined to give it to them, because during an overheated economy, when the economy is booming, skilled workers are in such short supply that you have to pay them a lot to keep them from doing what economists call job hopping, which is jumping to the next and the next job, whoever is willing to pay them more money. Well, in 2010, we're far from this problem at point D, but whether we're at point B in a recession or at point D where we have the problem of inflation taking place, neither one of them are desirable for different reasons, but still neither one of them are desirable. Let's move on to the next page and take a look at what happens when aggregate supply changes. So we've taken a look at 2 out of the 4 situations where aggregate demand decreases or increases. But we have aggregate supply too, and not surprisingly, that curve can change. So let's start out again at full employment, CPI 1, GDP 1. So here we have Roman numeral 3. This one we're going to look at decreases in aggregate supply and the problem it creates that is known as stagflation. To prepare for your final exam, you're going to take a look at a video series called The Commanding Heights. I'll reference more particularly where exactly to go there at the end of this lecture today. And in The Commanding Heights, you will see that in 1971 and more profoundly in 1973, we had something take place in our economy that had not been experienced before on the scale that it was taking place. Historically, the major problems that economists had to deal with and governments had to deal with were the problems of aggregate demand going down or up too much. That led one economist, very briefly, if we put the rate of inflation on the vertical axis and the unemployment rate on the horizontal axis, led one economist by the name of Phillips, when he observed historically, if we let every dot equal a different year in America's economic history, and we let a line run right through those to capture the relationship that we're observing, Mr. Phillips discovered, if you will, that in years when the unemployment rate was very high, say like it was in 1933 at 24.9%, that we had very low inflation, say 0.2%. And in years we had high rates of inflation, say 9%, we had low unemployment of, say, 3.5%. So Mr. Phillips showed the economics community, and the world for that matter, that we have to deal with this trade-off between unemployment and inflation. And that led a lot of governments and a lot of policymakers to reach the conclusion that all we had to do was somehow micromanage aggregate demand to keep it from going up too much or keeping it going down too much, and all of our problems would be solved. But, and I just realized I shouldn't have erased this. Pardon me. We can quickly recover it. But what Mr. Phillips could not explain, and what other economists had trouble explaining with respect to this Phillips curve, was 1971. and 1973. In fact, most of the 1970s. Notice we've got two dots where you have a very high rate of inflation and unemployment. This is what the 1970s looked like. This was supposed to be impossible, to have high inflation and high unemployment at the exact same time. Today, the Phillips curve has largely been relegated to a footnote in many macroeconomics books because it's no longer a given that you're going to have to deal with a good news, bad news scenario. If we take a look at aggregate supply, in 1971 and 1973, we were dealing with this scenario. Aggregate supply had decreased, where in equilibrium we were at point B, and notice in equilibrium at point B, you get the decrease in the gross domestic product, so you get the recession, but you also get an increase in the consumer price index. So you get the bad news here, and you get the bad news here. Please note, stagflation is the absolute worst event that can take place in any economy. Recessions and inflation caused by changes in aggregate demand, we get the good news, bad news scenarios. Here, with a decrease in stagflation, you get the increase in cyclical unemployment, you get the recession, and you get an increase in the consumer price index. This is a disaster. You will see in the commanding heights that by 1971, the accumulation of tax increases and increases in government regulation, increases in government spending that crowded out private sector investment, you'll see that by 1971, in many ways, government policy that was born out of the Roosevelt administration had caused aggregate supply to decrease. Very quickly, the three events that can cause aggregate supply to decrease: number one, when you get an increase in the input costs of production. That should sound familiar because this is from chapter 6 and 7 where we saw changes in input costs affect normal supply curves. When you get a decrease in the productivity of inputs, or when you get a decrease in the quantity of inputs, if any of these three take place, you will get a decrease in aggregate supply. By the way, when we're talking about productivity, we're talking about technology, education, research and development investments. So anything that affects the hourly output of workers or capital equipment. So the better we get at producing goods and services, and the more productive we are, the better the economy operates. But when we get decreases in educational quality, when we get decreases in labor productivity, when we get any of these events that cause us to produce less per hour, this is what's captured in B here, the decrease in the productivity of inputs. And of course, the decrease in the quantity of inputs simply means less labor, less capital, less entrepreneurship. So these are the events that can lead to a decrease in aggregate supply. I should mention to you one of the more dramatic moments in America's history, and in many cases, many ways, world history, took place in 1973. On the eve of the Jewish holiday Yom Kippur, in October of 1973, Syria and Egypt invaded Israel. And this was a disaster for the United States of America because Israel, as you know, is one of our Middle East allies. But the one reason it was a disaster is because in 1960, OPEC had been formed, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And from 1960 until 1973, OPEC really hadn't exercised that much power over the American oil companies and how much the oil companies had to pay for oil. In 1973, when this invasion took place, the United States of America rushed to Israel's support, and this so offended the members of the OPEC oil-producing countries that they decided to launch what was called the Arab oil embargo of 1973. where they told the United States of America, in essence, for your continued support of Israel, we're not only going to raise our prices dramatically that you have to pay us, but we're going to embargo you. We're going to cut back dramatically on the supply of oil to the United States of America. Think about it for a moment. Then and now, oil is a key input cost in the production of everything. Everything that's transported to your stores, from your cell phones to your cantaloupes, comes from the burning of oil. Makeup comes from petroleum byproducts. Plastics. Oil drives, and oil and the energy that we get from it drives everything we do in the American economy. And it was even a bigger influence back then because we're more of a technology-driven economy today, and our cars get better gas mileage, and we don't rely on oil as much as a percentage of our total economy as we did back then. But back then, it was enormous. So when there was a cutback in the supply of oil prices overnight jumped dramatically, and oil prices stayed high, running right through the early 1980s. Well, since this key input cost went up dramatically in price, businesses, with their input costs going up, businesses started to cut back on the supply of goods and services. They were less willing and able to supply us than they were before, and the accumulation of all of these businesses around the country cutting back on supply led to what economists call a supply-side shock, where we got a dramatic decrease, in this particular case, to aggregate supply. So again, for your reading, focus primarily on 1971 and the forces that were already leading to stagflation, and we'll talk more about that in the next lecture. But 1973 was a more dramatic picture of a sudden change to aggregate supply. So here we see when aggregate supply decreases, worst case scenario for the economy. Let's take a look at the best case scenario for any economy. CPI, GDP, label this AS1, AD, point A, CPI 1, GDP 1. To summarize what we've done so far, a decrease in aggregate demand gives us good news and bad news. An increase in aggregate demand gives us good news and bad news. Of course, if the changes are significant enough to cause a recession or inflation. A decrease in aggregate supply, all bad news. So what we're left with is analyzing the effects of an increase in aggregate supply, and we'll see that it is all good news. Okay. If the determinants of aggregate supply are input costs, the productivity of key inputs, labor, capital, and what have you, and the quantity of inputs, if an increase in input costs, a decrease in productivity, a decrease in quantity can lead to a decrease in aggregate supply, it stands by a logical reasoning that if we get lower input costs, an increase in the productivity of key inputs, or an increase in the quantity of inputs, then we should get the opposite result. Now, you'll recall reading in Chapter 6 something about Say's law. And you'll recall Chapter 7 looking at the effects of changes in technology when it comes to high-definition television sets. An increase in aggregate supply is a rightward shift in the entire aggregate supply curve. This is going to be Roman numeral 4, an increase in aggregate supply, which is called non-inflationary economic growth. It is the ideal scenario for any economy to go through. If you look at it graphically, whenever we get aggregate supply to increase, with all the new suppliers coming in, prices go down, and as a result of lower prices and the aggregate supply shifting that led to the lower prices, we get an increase in the GDP. So the growth in GDP economic growth, that's good for us. The lower prices are good for us. Think of this, again, on the micro scale with respect to high-definition television sets. More supply leads to lower prices, and, of course, the better quality that we've gotten as a result, and those lower prices helps give those people that are working an opportunity to purchase these things, and when they purchase more of them, quantity goes up, and, of course, during a period of non-inflationary economic growth, you also get low rates of inflation. So economic growth, low rates of inflation, low unemployment. So in this particular case, you can get falling unemployment without having to worry about inflation. Well, the big debate among economists is, how do you go about achieving an increase in aggregate supply? Well, I want you to take a look for a moment at this video where one of our former presidents discusses one of the ways that economists of many different political persuasions believe is the key to increasing aggregate supply in the long run. Let's take a look.
In 1981, our critics charged that letting you keep more of your earnings would trigger an inflationary explosion, send interest rates soaring, and destroy our economy. Well, we cut your tax rates anyway, by nearly 25%. And what that helped trigger was falling inflation, falling interest rates, and the strongest economic expansion in 30 years. Over the course of this century, our tax system has been modified dozens of times and in hundreds of ways. Yet most of those changes didn't improve the system. They made it more like Washington itself, complicated, unfair, cluttered with gobbledygook and loopholes designed for those with the power and influence to hire high-priced legal and tax advisors. But there's more to it than that. Some years ago, an historian, I believe, said that every time in the past when a government began taxing above a certain level of the people's earnings, trust in government began to erode. He said it would begin with efforts to avoid paying the full tax. This would become outright cheating and eventually a distrust and contempt of government itself until there would be a breakdown in law and order. Well, how many times have we heard people brag about clever schemes to avoid paying taxes, or watched luxuries casually written off to be paid for by somebody else, that somebody being you? I believe that in both spirit and substance, our tax system has come to be un-American. How would the proposal work? The present tax system has 14 different brackets of tax rates ranging from 11 to 50%. We would take a giant step toward an ideal system by replacing all that with a simple 3-bracket system with tax rates of 15, 25, and 35%. By lowering everyone's tax rates all the way up the income scale, each of us will have a greater incentive to climb higher, to excel, to help America grow. The power of these incentives would send one simple, straightforward message to an entire nation. America, go for it. To young Americans wondering tonight, where will I go? What will I do with my future? I have a suggestion. Why not set out with your friends on the path of adventure and try to start up your own business? Follow in the footsteps of those 2 college students who launched one of America's great computer firms from the garage behind their house. You too can help us unlock the doors to a golden future. You too can become leaders in this great new era of progress, the age of the entrepreneur.
Ronald Reagan, and when you go to the course website and click on speeches, as I'm doing at this time, Ronald Reagan and one of his predecessors, John F. Kennedy, both believed, and I strongly encourage you for your preparation for the final exam that you take a look at the Kennedy speech on taxes as well. Both John F. Kennedy, a Democrat, and Ronald Reagan, a Republican, believed deeply, and you'll see in the Kennedy words they're almost a mirror image of President Reagan. They believed deeply that in order to create long-run economic growth for the American people, growth that would bring down the rate of inflation, bring down the rate of unemployment, and increase stability and promote prosperity, that one of the key ways to do that was to tell you that we're going to let you keep more of your money. Now, this sounds like common sense, but if you think about what's going on, or Again, I don't know when you're watching this what was going on during the first couple of years that Mr. Obama was president. Here we are in July of 2010. The economy is barely growing. Some economists are concerned that we're going back into another recession. And President Obama has proposed, and this is set to take place in 2011, has proposed an increase in income tax rates, an increase in the capital gains tax rate. The capital gains rate is currently 20%, 15% on some investments, but it's set to go back. He has said he wants to go back to 28%. This is the tax rate you have to pay when you sell real estate or stocks or bonds, whatever the case might be. We're set to have an increase in taxes to pay for much of his health care initiative that will begin in 2014. He has talked about increasing taxes on coal and oil to help reduce the problem of global warming. And this is just the beginning. So if you think about your own situation, when you look at your paycheck, when you look at where it says gross pay, what you and your employer agreed to, multiplied by how many hours you work, and then you take a look at net pay, which of those two would you prefer to take home every week? If you would prefer to take home gross, what you're saying is that you believe you would be better off and you would be able to do more things for yourself and your family if you could keep more of your own money. We work ultimately so that our pay for our own purposes and the purposes of taking care of our families is as high as it can be. Now, of course, economists understand that as long as there are governments, the government is going to need revenue to pay for its constitutional functions of protecting our life, liberty, and property. But governments also need to understand, and Kennedy and Reagan understood this, that if you want to create economic growth, and Mr. Obama has been talking about wanting the economy to grow again, that historically one of the best ways to do this is to tell people all up and down the income scale, rich, middle class, and poor, that the government is going to allow you to keep more of your own money. Because if it does, think about it, among people that are in their teenage years, early 20s that don't make a lot, getting to keep more of your own money enables you to pay your rent, to maybe have a nicer car, to get new tires, to buy a few extra CDs, whatever the case might be. This contributes to economic activity. Getting to keep more of your own money as you continue to make more money encourages you to invest more, maybe to start a new business. It encourages you, by lowering your taxes, it encourages you to go ahead and maybe get a master's degree in your field, because now your net pay is going to be higher and it's going to be worth the investment. After all, we all have to do a cost-benefit analysis as to whether or not more education, more training, more work hours is worth it. And the more money you get to take home, the more those investments become worth it. Think about people at the upper income scale. Now, in many ways, the politics and economics of envy is very attractive to people, to look at people that make a lot of money and to castigate them as being some sort of villains or people that we should go after to get their money to make our circumstances more fair. But if we look at this pragmatically and rationally, let's look at what wealthier individuals actually do. If the government cuts the taxes of a college student, again, maybe you buy a slightly better car. If the government cuts the income taxes of a college professor, maybe I'll try to start a small business, or I'll go on a longer vacation, or put an addition to my home, whatever. The government cuts the taxes of people in the tax brackets of Oprah Winfrey and Bill Gates and people like this. They're going to expand their businesses. Oprah may start a new magazine or hire 500 new people to open a TV production studio, whatever the case might be. John F. Kennedy, when he took over as president, the top income tax rate was 91%. That meant that the most productive Americans had to pay 91% of their income in taxes. It had been as high as 94% during the 1950s. Kennedy managed to push through legislation, and you'll see him talking about it online, that got the top tax rate down to 70%. Now you may think to yourself, you mean if this is 1964 and I graduate from college and I become extremely productive, I get to keep 30% and the government takes 70%? Yes, but 70 is less than 91, isn't it? So Kennedy got past the largest tax cuts as a percentage of the GDP of any tax cuts we've ever had. And as a result, the 1960s saw increases in productivity because workers felt like they now had more of a reason to work because they were going to keep more of their own money. You saw an increase in the rate of economic growth, a decrease in unemployment, a decrease in the rate of inflation, because what happened was with lower taxes, especially among the people that create jobs, and this is what is so important for you economics students to understand, the job creators are the businesses out there. They're the ones that have to take the risk of starting these new businesses or expanding businesses so that we can ultimately work for them. I work here in Orlando largely because of the efforts of Walt Disney back in the late 1960s. By him taking the entrepreneurial activities from California to Florida, he created an environment from which Orlando could grow and create enough of a demand where there would be a demand for economics professors eventually here in a town that used to be primarily cattle and orange groves. So when taxes get cut, you end up seeing people take more risk, they're more productive, and the 1960s was a period of tremendous economic activity. When Ronald Reagan became president, the top tax rate, as you saw, was 70%. You also saw that we had 14 different brackets at that particular time. Now, he argued, he tried to get, or his ideal system, he said, was to get us, or moving towards an ideal system, he wanted 3 income tax brackets. But he was so good at negotiation, he managed to get 2 income tax brackets. The top rate was 28% by 1986, and the lowest tax rate was 15%. So when he took over in 1981, if you were an extremely productive entrepreneurial individual in America, you were going to pay 70% of your earnings to the United States government. By 1986, just 5 years later, you were only going to be asked to pay 28%. Now let's just do simple arithmetic. If your boss said to you, look, I'd like to give you $10 for working, but out of that $10, I need to take $7 back away from you to put in a company fund to pay for our annual picnic. So you'll get $10, but you'll get to keep $3. How productive would you be? Would you even stay at that company and work for them? What if your boss said to you, okay, I'm going to pay you $10, and we're going to take $2.80. We're going to take 28% to put towards the company picnic. So now you get to keep $7.20. You're still not going to be happy about it. After all, who's happy about paying taxes? But $7.20 is more than $3, isn't it? So by mathematical logic, the more of your own money you get to keep, the more productive you're going to be, the more inclined you're going to be to want to work harder, work longer, maybe take a second job, maybe improve your education skill and training. And as a result of doing that, what we saw on a macroeconomic scale, both from the Kennedy tax cuts and the Reagan tax cuts, the 1980s, after Reagan's tax cuts were finished, dramatic drops in unemployment, economic growth, and drops in inflation as well. So we got tremendous economic growth both in the 80s and the 60s, and even if you look back at the tax cuts of the 1920s. Every time government has adopted income tax reform on a massive scale, the result has been non-inflationary economic growth as a result of an increase in aggregate supply. Now, taxes aren't the only thing that affects aggregate supply. Many other things do as well. I'm holding a copy of the Wall Street Journal from July 12, 2010. The article is entitled, Revisiting the Regulations Affecting Business. Many businesses are now going to the Obama administration expressing deep concern about all of the rules that the Obama administration has either put on businesses or is proposing to put on businesses. The laundry list, FCC controls on broadband internet, EPA regulations of greenhouse gases, increased taxes on foreign earnings, shareholder rights to nominate directors have been new rules on who can do that, new requirements on derivatives trading, expanded damages for pay discrimination, healthcare legislation moving forward, and restrictions on deep water drilling. Now, you may hear some of these things and say, well, look, we need restrictions on deep water drilling, and we need, one of them here, an end to secret ballots in union elections. You may say we need greater regulations on greenhouse gases or more government control over broadband internet, whatever. But remember, when you run a business someday, every rule the government passes is a cost that you're going to have to incur. You're going to have your legal team comply with this. You're going to have to spend money to make sure you're complying. You're going to have audits to make sure you're complying. And this costs money. We do not live in a world of the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy, okay? This is real money that businesses have to pay. Now you as a consumer, as a college student out there, what do you think businesses are going to do if the government imposes more regulations on business and businesses are now facing higher costs? Do you think those businesses are simply going to absorb those costs and say that out of a deep love and affection for consumers, we're going to do nothing about this? Or do you suppose that businesses might say, okay, we have two choices. We can raise our prices to try to recover some of these costs, or maybe we can look at other areas of costs and try to cut back somewhere else. If government is forcing us to incur these costs, maybe we can cut back somewhere else. You should know that on average, the average American business, out of every dollar they earn, 70% of it goes to labor, wages, salaries, benefits, workman's compensation, payroll taxes. So you can bet that if these regulations continue to pile up, it will have the effect, and you'll see this in the commanding heights, the effect of regulation. The more regulations businesses incur, the more reluctant they are to hire new workers, expand their businesses, or even start up as a business if they see these are the regulations they're going to face. So taxes, regulations, and as you'll see in Chapter 13, everything from immigration policy, education reform. You remember the video you watched entitled Stupid in America about public education. Ask yourself this question. If the quality of American education continues to go down over the next several years, lower quality education is going to do what to the productivity of workers? That's right, it's going to drive it down. Lower and lower productivity means businesses having to spend more and more on training of American workers or more to recruit workers that have those skills from India, China, Brazil, Eastern Europe. So as you get into Chapter 13, you'll see many more things that can affect aggregate supply. All of Chapter 13 is devoted to this idea of aggregate supply and how we can make it grow. But make no mistake about it, if the first three major events that can take place, decreases and increases in aggregate demand, decreases in aggregate supply, if we either get a trade-off between those or all bad news, and if there's only one economic event that can cause everything to go well in the economy, an increase in aggregate supply, it's important that you study those factors and pay attention to those people talking about these things so that you can be in a position to encourage policymakers, encourage people asking for your vote to pursue those initiatives that will lead to more aggregate supply in the long run and more prosperity for all of us, rich, poor, and middle class. Going forward, I would like to show you what you need to watch before the next lecture on chapters 12 and 13. If you go to the speeches link, first of all, make sure that you take a look at this corresponds to 12 and 13, the economics of privatization, the foolishness of Keynesian economics. Anything in here that involves chapters 12 and 13 you should watch next. But the most important part, if you click on the commanding heights, you will see, starting with chapter 2, the old order fails. You need to watch chapter 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You can skip chapter 10. You need to watch chapter 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. You can watch those. Notice it says here Windows Media, Low and High. All of this is available through PBS. But watching this series, and I believe in total it's maybe 2 hours of viewing, so don't feel overwhelmed. This will put you in a wonderful position to understand chapters 12 and 13 and to do much better on the final exam. So until next time, have a good day, and I hope today's lecture was useful to you. Thank you.